In 1577, the Lord Deputy of Ireland, Sir Henry Sidney, wrote a letter to his son Philip. In it, he described a woman he had recently met on the western coast. He called her a most famous feminine sea captain called Grace O'Malley, and reported that she had offered him her services with 3 galleys and 200 fighting men at her command. Sidney had governed Ireland for years. He had met chieftains, earls, rebel lords, and soldiers of every rank. But something about this woman compelled him to put her into writing. He did not describe her as a wife or a widow, a mother or a dependent. He described her as a captain. And then he added a detail that tells you everything about the impression she made. He wrote, "She was as well by sea as by land, well more than Mrs. Mate with him." In other words, she was not her husband's subordinate. She was his superior. That letter survives today in the English state papers. It is one of the earliest official English records of a woman named Grain ní Maile, Grace O'Malley, the woman who would, 16 years later, sail into the heart of the English Empire and sit across from Queen Elizabeth I, not as a subject, but as a negotiator. And what makes this story extraordinary is not the legend, it is the paperwork. Because almost everything we know about Grace O'Malley comes not from Irish sources, where she was deliberately erased, but from English administrative documents, petitions, letters, military reports, tax records, and one extraordinary questionnaire preserved in the state papers of Ireland under the reference SP 63-170 that reveals more about this woman's life than any ballad ever could. To understand how a Gaelic woman from County Mayo ended up negotiating face-to-face with the most powerful monarch in Europe, you have to understand the world she was born into, and the world that was trying to destroy it. Grain ní Maile was born around 1530 into the O'Malley clan, whose territory stretched along the rugged Atlantic coastline of what is now County Mayo, in the west of Ireland. Their domain was centred on Clew Bay, a body of water studded with hundreds of small islands and guarded at its mouth by Clare Island, a natural fortress. The O'Malleys were not farmers. They were seafarers. For generations, their power came from the ocean. They traded, they fished, they ferried, and, when opportunity or necessity demanded, they plundered. Ships passing through their waters paid tribute, or they did not pass. Fishermen from as far away as England paid what the O'Malleys called black rent for the right to work those seas. The head of the family held the title O'Maile, simply the O'Malley, and their motto, inscribed in Latin, translated to a single phrase: powerful by land and by sea. Grace was the daughter of the chieftain Eochaid Dubhdara O'Maile, Owen Black Oak O'Malley, and from childhood she was trained in the family trade. The famous story, repeated in oral tradition for centuries, says that when she begged her father to take her on a trading voyage to Spain, he refused, saying her long hair would get caught in the ship's ropes. She cut it off. The nickname that followed her for life, Grain Maol, meaning bald Grace or cropped hair Grace, was later anglicized to Granuaile. Whether that specific incident happened exactly as the tradition says, the outcome is not in dispute. Grace went to sea. By the time she was 16, she was married to Donal an Choghaid, Donal of the War, O'Flaithharte, heir to the chieftaincy of the O'Flaherty clan. This was a strategic alliance that doubled her reach, extending her influence from Mayo into Connemara. Together, they controlled substantial territory. Records suggest they owned as many as 1,000 head of cattle and horses. She bore him 3 children, Owen, Maeve, and Murrow. But the marriage was also a political education. Through the O'Flahertys, Grace learned how Gaelic clans maneuvered against each other, how alliances shifted, how power was held and lost. And she learned it well. Because when Donal was killed in an ambush around 1565, murdered by the Joyce clan in a dispute over a castle on Lough Corrib, Grace did not retreat into widowhood. She fought back. According to tradition, she attacked the castle where Donald's killers sheltered. She won. The people renamed it Hen's Castle in her honor. And then she did something that no one expected. She took a portion of the O'Flaherty warriors who were loyal to her, not to her dead husband, but to her, and she returned to O'Malley territory. She went home, and she took command. Under Gaelic Brehon law, women held a legal status that would not exist in English common law for centuries. A woman could own property, divorce her husband, and retain her assets after a marriage ended. Grace used every provision available to her. When her father died, she assumed active leadership of the O'Malley lordship, despite having a brother. This was unusual even by Gaelic standards, but no one who knew her questioned it. She commanded the fleet. She commanded the men. She commanded the coastline. And for the next 3 decades, she built a power base that made her one of the most formidable figures on the western seaboard of Ireland. She married again, this time to Richard an Iarain Bork, known as Iron Richard, a powerful lord who controlled Rockfleet Castle on the shores of Clew Bay. The marriage, according to Gaelic tradition, could be dissolved after 1 year by either party. Folklore says that after the year was up, Grace locked herself inside Rockfleet Castle, leaned from a window, and shouted to Richard, "I dismiss you." Whether the story is true in its specifics, the outcome is documented. She kept the castle. Rockfleet became her base of operations for the rest of her life. But while Grace was consolidating power on the Atlantic coast, the world around her was changing in ways that no amount of galleys or fighting men could stop. The Tudor reconquest of Ireland was accelerating. Since the Norman invasion of 1169, England had claimed sovereignty over Ireland. But for centuries, effective English control barely extended beyond the Pale, the small area around Dublin. Beyond the Pale, Gaelic lords governed by their own laws, their own customs, their own language. The O'Malleys, the O'Flahertys, the Burkes. These were autonomous powers. They owed nothing to London. Elizabeth I intended to change that. She viewed Ireland as a strategic vulnerability. Her enemies, Spain, the papacy, could use Ireland as a backdoor to attack England. The old Gaelic saying captured it precisely. "He that will England win, first with Ireland must begin." Elizabeth's response was systematic. English administrators were sent to impose English law, English land tenure, English religion. Gaelic customs were suppressed. Chieftains were pressured to submit to the crown, surrender their lands, and receive them back as English-style grants, stripping away the autonomy that had defined their world for centuries. In Connaught, the instrument of this policy was a document called the Composition of Connaught, imposed in 1585. Under its terms, Gaelic lords would pay money rents instead of levying traditional tributes. Mercenary soldiers, gallows glass, were forbidden. English law replaced Brehon law. The great chieftains would no longer be independent warlords. They would be tenants of the English crown. In southern Connaught, the composition was grudgingly accepted. In the north, in Mayo, in O'Malley country, it was a different matter entirely. The man tasked with enforcing the new order in Connaught was Sir Richard Bingham, appointed Lord President of the province in 1584. Bingham was a soldier, not a diplomat. He had served in the Netherlands and had a reputation for ruthlessness. He arrived in Connaught with a simple mission: break the power of the Gaelic lords. And from the moment he set foot in Mayo, his primary target was Grace O'Malley. Bingham's hostility toward Grace was both strategic and personal. She represented everything the New English Order sought to eliminate. A Gaelic leader who operated outside English law, who controlled territory by force and custom, who commanded men and ships, and who happened to be a woman doing all of this in a world that the English found incomprehensible. In his official correspondence, Bingham described her as a notable traitoress and a director of thieves and murderers at sea. In one letter that has survived in the state papers, he delivered his most famous assessment. She had been, he wrote, nurse to all rebellions in the province for this 40 years. The campaign Bingham waged against Grace was systematic and devastating. He killed her eldest son, Owen, tricked and murdered by Bingham's own brother. He confiscated her cattle herds, her horse herds, her property. He established an English garrison in Rockfleet Castle. He arrested her allies, undermined her alliances, and sought to reduce her to poverty and irrelevance. By 1593, Grace O'Malley, once the most powerful figure on the western coast of Ireland, was, by her own account in a later petition, in a state of near destitution. And then Bingham made a mistake. He arrested Grace's youngest son, Tibbot Bourke, known as Tibbot Nalong, Theobald of the Ships, and charged him with treason. He also arrested her half-brother, Donal Napiopa, on charges of murdering English soldiers. Both men faced execution. For any other Gaelic lord, the options would have been limited: submit, rebel, or flee. Grace chose none of these. She chose something that no Irish chieftain had ever attempted, something so audacious that it borders on the unbelievable, except that every step of it is documented in the English state papers. She decided to go over Bingham's head. She would sail to England and petition the Queen directly. Consider what this meant. Grace O'Malley was not a diplomat. She was not an ambassador. She was, by every English legal standard, a pirate and a rebel. London was a city where pirates were executed at Wapping Dock, their corpses left hanging over the Thames as a warning. For a woman accused of 40 years of rebellion to voluntarily enter the seat of English power was either an act of supreme confidence or supreme desperation. It was probably both. In June 1593, Grace composed a formal petition, written on her behalf by a scribe, since the petition itself is in English, a language she may not have written fluently. The document, preserved in the state papers as SP 63-170, is remarkable for its strategic intelligence. Grace acknowledged her past. She admitted that circumstances had constrained your Highness's fond subject to take arms, and by force to maintain herself and her people by sea and land the space of 40 years past. She framed her piracy not as rebellion, but as survival. She asked for some reasonable maintenance for the little time she hath to live. And then she made an offer. She would surrender the lands of her 2 sons and her surviving Bourke nephews to the crown, and in return she asked for free liberty during her life to invade with sword and fire all your Highness enemies, wheresoever they are or shall be. She was offering Elizabeth her fleet, her men, and her knowledge of the Irish coast, in exchange for the freedom of her family and the right to keep doing exactly what she had always done. Elizabeth did not respond with a yes or a no. She responded with something far more revealing, with curiosity. Through Lord Burghley, her chief advisor, Elizabeth sent Grace a document that has become one of the most important primary sources in Irish maritime history, the 18 Articles of Interrogatory. These were not casual questions. They were a formal investigation. 18 specific inquiries about Grace's life, her family, her marriages, her property, her means of support, and the customs of Gaelic society. Who was her father? How did she maintain herself after her husband's deaths? What lands did she claim? How did Gaelic inheritance work? What were the rights of women under Brehon law? Grace's answers, preserved alongside the questions in the state papers, are a masterpiece of political navigation. She answered truthfully, but selectively. She described herself not as a pirate, but as a woman forced by circumstance to provide for her people. She downplayed her military activities and emphasized her legitimate claims under both Gaelic and English legal frameworks. Intriguingly, she identified herself as the widow of Richard Burke. perhaps calculating that an English court would more readily sympathize with a widow than with a Gaelic chieftain in her own right. Her answers gave enough information to intrigue, but not enough to incriminate. They were, in short, the responses of a woman who understood power, understood negotiation, and understood that her audience was not Burghley, but the Queen herself. And it worked. Despite Bingham's furious objections, he wrote letters to Burghley protesting that Grace was manipulating the crown and would only use any concessions to foment further rebellion. Elizabeth agreed to grant Grace an audience. In late July 1593, Grace O'Malley sailed from Clew Bay. The voyage took her around the southern coast of Ireland, through the English Channel, past the Straits of Dover, and up the Thames to Greenwich. She was approximately 63 years old. She had spent her entire life on the Atlantic Ocean, in conditions that killed experienced sailors routinely. She had survived imprisonment, war, betrayal, the murder of her son, and the systematic destruction of her world. And now she was sailing into the most heavily guarded waterway in England toward the palace where Elizabeth Tudor had been born 60 years before. No contemporary account describes what Grace saw when she arrived at Greenwich Palace. But the contrast must have been staggering. Anne Chambers, Grace's biographer, reconstructed the scene from period descriptions. Tapestry-covered walls, carved oak furniture, ornate plaster ceilings, corridors filled with courtiers in silk and jewels, the perfumed machinery of Elizabethan power. And into this world walked a woman whose face, as Chambers wrote, bore the evidence of decades on the open Atlantic, a weather-beaten sea captain in the most opulent court in Europe. The meeting took place in September 1593. There is no transcript. No courtier recorded the conversation. No minutes survive. What we know comes from the outcomes, from subsequent correspondence, and from oral traditions that were collected by the Irish scholar John O'Donovan in the 1830s and 1840s, traditions passed down by people who had spoken to people who knew Grace personally. According to tradition, the two women conversed in Latin, since Elizabeth did not speak Irish, and Grace either could not or would not speak English. One persistent story claims that Grace refused to bow to Elizabeth, on the grounds that she did not recognize Elizabeth as Queen of Ireland and therefore owed her no deference. Another says that Grace was searched before entering the royal presence and found to be carrying a dagger. She told the guards it was for her own protection. Elizabeth, reportedly, allowed her to keep it. A third tradition, the most charming and perhaps the most invented, describes Elizabeth offering Grace a lace handkerchief. Grace, unfamiliar with the English custom of carrying and reusing handkerchiefs, blew her nose into it and threw it into the fire. Elizabeth was reportedly amused. These stories may be embellished, they may be partly or entirely apocryphal. But what is not legend, what is preserved in the black ink of administrative records, is what happened next. Elizabeth granted Grace's petitions, all of them. Tibbet Bourke was ordered released from Athlone prison. Donal na Piopa was ordered freed. Grace's confiscated property was to be restored. And Bingham, the Lord President of Connaught, the man who had spent a decade trying to destroy Grace O'Malley, was instructed by his own sovereign to leave her alone. The Queen of England overruled her own military governor on the word of a woman that governor had called nurse to all rebellions. This is the fact that no ballad, no folklore, no romantic retelling can improve upon. The documents say it plainly. Elizabeth chose Grace over Bingham. The administrative record does not explain why. There is no memo, no diary entry, no letter in which Elizabeth reveals her reasoning. But the decision itself is the evidence. Something about Grace O'Malley, her answers to the 18 questions, her presence in the room, her willingness to sail into the heart of enemy territory for the sake of her children, persuaded the Queen of England to do something her advisers explicitly warned her against. Bingham was predictably furious. He delayed implementing the Queen's orders, finding excuses and bureaucratic obstacles to prevent the release of Tibbet and the restoration of Grace's property. His obstruction was so persistent that Grace was forced to return to England a second time in 1595 to petition Lord Burghley again. This time, the Earl of Ormond, Elizabeth's cousin and favourite, intervened on Grace's behalf. A commission was eventually established to investigate and restore the lands in Mayo claimed by her family. But the larger story was already written. The Gaelic world that Grace had known was collapsing. The 9 Years' War, the great final rebellion of Gaelic Ireland, led by Hugh O'Neill of Tyrone and Hugh Roe O'Donnell of Tyrconnell, erupted across the country from 1593 to 1603. Grace had promised Elizabeth her ships and men in exchange for protection. Whether she actually delivered on that promise is unclear, and the evidence suggests she did not, at least not in the way she had specified. In 1600, the captain of an English warship reported engaging a galley belonging to Grace O'Malley, suggesting that even in her 70s, she was still at sea, still commanding, still operating on her own terms. Grace O'Malley died around 1603, most likely at Rockfleet Castle, the fortress she had kept through marriage, divorce, war, and dispossession. She was approximately 73 years old. Tradition holds that she was buried on Clare Island, at the Cistercian Abbey, where the O'Malleys had been interred for generations. Elizabeth I died the same year. Two women who had faced each other across a table at Greenwich Palace, one the sovereign of an empire, the other the ruler of a stretch of Atlantic coastline, departed the world within months of each other. And then something curious happened to Grace O'Malley's memory. She was erased from both sides. English historians had little interest in commemorating a Gaelic pirate who had successfully defied their colonial apparatus. Irish historians, for different reasons, also chose to ignore her. In the nationalist tradition that developed over the following centuries, heroes were those who fought for Ireland against England. Grace had not done that. She had fought for herself, for her family, for her clan. She had negotiated with the English crown when it suited her. She had offered Elizabeth her ships. In the binary world of Irish nationalist historiography, that made her a collaborator, not a patriot. The Irish Annals, the great chronicles compiled by Gaelic scholars, do not mention her at all. For nearly 400 years, Grace O'Malley existed primarily in oral tradition. In songs, in stories told along the Mayo coast, in the memories of fishing families who knew her name, but had no books to point to. That changed in 1979, when a young Irish researcher named Anne Chambers published a biography titled Granuaile, Ireland's Pirate Queen. Chambers had done what no historian before her had thought to do, or perhaps had thought worth doing. She went to the English state papers. She found Grace's petition. She found the Articles of Interrogatory and Grace's answers. She found Bingham's letters, Sidney's reports, the administrative correspondence that documented, in meticulous bureaucratic detail, the life of a woman that both Irish and English history had tried to forget. Chambers' biography became a milestone in Irish publishing. Grace O'Malley was restored to the historical record, not as a legend, not as a folk heroine, but as a documented political figure whose life could be traced through the archives of the empire that had tried to destroy her. Today, Grace O'Malley is part of the Irish school curriculum. Her image appears on stamps and statues. A sculpture stands at Westport House in County Mayo, near the waters she once controlled. She remains the only woman recorded on the Baptista Boasio map of Ireland, drawn in 1599, a cartographic fact that says more about her impact than any ballad. But perhaps the most fitting monument to Grace O'Malley is the document that survives in the English state papers under the reference SP 63-170. A petition, written in July 1593, in which a 63-year-old woman from the western edge of Europe addressed the most powerful monarch on the continent. She did not beg. She did not grovel. She stated her case, offered her terms, and waited for an answer. In 1577, Sir Henry Sidney called her a most famous feminine sea captain. In 1593, Sir Richard Bingham called her nurse to all rebellions for 40 years. In September of that same year, Queen Elizabeth I called her into the room. 4 centuries later, the room remembered.